This was one of the videos recorded for one of the meetings at Ratio Christi at UTSA. Aside from a few minor edits to clean up the long pauses, the ums and the uhs, it's virtually the exact same video, but in any case, here's the video. Hope y'all enjoy. As we go ahead and get some food, I'd just like to welcome y'all. Good afternoon to I believe it's the fourth meeting for Ratio Christi at UTSA. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lydia McGrew. Dr. Lydia McGrew is an analytic philosopher and author whose work spans philosophy of religion, epistemology, and New Testament studies. She has written extensively on the reliability of the Gospels and the evidential basis for Christian faith, bringing a rigorous philosophical approach to questions of history and belief. Her books and scholarship have made her a respected voice in both academic and popular discussions. We're honored to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lydia McGrew.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And of course, I'm the wife of Tim, who spoke to you last week on the forgotten legacy of other works of apologetics. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about how you can know that Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm going to be sharing my slides, which are also my outline. And we'll have a question and answer time after the end of my presentation and a very, very short break. So let me get my slides up here and go to view show. There we are. Okay, I'm checking the time here. Okay, so how you can know that Jesus rose from the dead. I want to start with just a beginning point. Jesus died. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the scholars who agree that Jesus died, or even about the Muslim view that he didn't. I think we're going to take that as read, that Jesus died. And that's not hard to believe. There's nothing very remarkable about it. The Romans crucified a lot of people. It's what happened next that is really unusual, because just a few days after he died, his followers started saying that he literally, physically rose again from the dead. And they started saying this in public at large meetings of people in public about 6 weeks later. That's when they were getting people together and saying, we want everybody to know, literally standing out on the streets, that Jesus rose from the dead. That's at least somewhat unusual. So we've got to explain that. There are three options for explaining what Jesus' disciples claimed. They were liars, they were mistaken, or Jesus really rose from the dead. Now I want to pause and clarify something here. Even though this trilemma and the argument that follows sound deductive, this is actually a non-deductive argument. This is just a convenient way of laying out the options. It's going to be, very probably, overwhelmingly probably, they were not liars. Overwhelmingly probably, they were not just mistaken. Therefore, Jesus really rose from the dead. Overwhelmingly probably. All right. As with most of the important things in life, like, does my spouse exist? Am I an alien? Cartesian certainty is not possible. But the older authors, some of the people Tim probably talked to you about last week, used to use the phrase moral certainty, which is sort of like confidence beyond reasonable doubt. And that is possible in empirical matters based on strong non-deductive arguments. So I want to start with the question, were they lying? Now, when we're evaluating a claim like this, we should not be squeamish about that question. Were they lying? Christians for centuries have not ducked that. When I'm faced with claims that, someone...
Dr. McGrew, you didn't change slides.
Oh, I didn't change slides? Is that showing? What are you seeing?
So Jesus died, then what?
Wow. So that didn't go to the three options? You're not seeing that?
No.
Wow. Okay, let me try something else. It must not be working well with...
Okay, yeah, now we see it.
Now you see it? All right, so what we're going to have to do here is it's apparently not working well with the view slideshow. So what I'm going to do you'll just have to see this side pane here, and I'll just click on the next slide so you can read it. You think, will that work? So like right now, you can see, were they lying, right?
Yep.
Okay, we'll just do it this way. It's not quite as pretty as sharing, the full screen option, but we'll just do it this way. And I think when I'm faced with some group of people who say, we had tea with Elvis Presley the other day, I immediately do consider the possibility that they're pulling my leg, that they're lying, it's some kind of fraud. This is one of the ways in which the claims for the resurrection differ from claims for many other miracles. It has to be admitted that for many other claimed miracles or even paranormal events, nobody really risks anything much but maybe some ridicule, being thought to be kind of a nut if they're making the whole thing up. But the context of the claims of the apostles makes it very improbable that they were lying. We can see this by looking at the book of Acts. Notice that what I'm pointing out here is not in itself a miracle. All right, that they claimed these things under these circumstances in this context, that's not a miracle. What's highly unusual is that they made these claims publicly to a hostile audience and in an attempt to found a new religious group. It is much easier to get away with religious fraud when the miracle claims are being circulated only within a group that is already disposed to believe them. And it's very interesting. I've been reading some skeptics lately, and they will act like that was the circumstance. Bart Ehrman will do this. I was reading Michael Goulder today, the skeptic Michael Goulder. He'll say, "Oh, people had a incentive for claiming that they had seen Jesus because it made them look like, they had lots of faith and they fit in with the rest of the religious group." They were actually founding this larger religious group, and they were going out there in an outward facing way, in a public facing way, and making these claims to an audience that was going to be hostile. And we can see this in Acts. We can even see what the hostility was like. They're being dragged before the leaders and told to shut up on multiple occasions. So there's a big difference between making such claims in the context of an existing religion that is maybe already under persecution, okay, but the religion already exists, and then you're just making the claims to your immediate surrounding co-religionists, and making these claims to an audience that is going to persecute you for making those very claims. It would have been simpler for the disciples just to go on being good Jews, just kind of go back to their previous lives and leave it at that, and have their relationship with God through the sacrificial system and so forth. And as mentioned before, it's a lot easier to get away with lying about the paranormal when there's no penalty beyond a purely social penalty of being laughed at or disbelieved. Now, Jesus' followers knew right from the beginning, right from that first day of Pentecost when they started standing up before an audience of thousands, that they were risking their lives. They knew that because Jesus had just been crucified 6 weeks before. Some of them paid with their lives. I do want to make clear, I am not saying that all 11 plus Matthias, who was the replacement for Judas, all 12 of these guys actually died. In fact, I think John, the beloved disciple, he was sent to prison on the island of Patmos, but I think he may have just died a natural death. So don't quote me as saying they all died, but they all risked death in a very credible way, and some of them did die. Notice that Acts 1 lists all the 11 disciples, tells about electing Matthias, and specifically connects them with Peter's sermon on Pentecost. There are skeptics out there who will say, oh, Acts is just the Peter and John show, and then later on it's just the Paul show. That's not true. From Acts chapters 1 through 7, the 12 are clearly named. They're clearly the ones who are in those chapters being designated as the apostles. And they're clearly being associated with this message and the risks being taken for this message. For example, in chapter 5, it says that Peter and John and other apostles. The other apostles were beaten. So that's at least, several more people beyond Peter and John actually being beaten. Now, we're talking here about people who were in a position to know whether what they were claiming was true or false. If it was false, they didn't have to stick their necks out. They could have just not made the claims. That's easy enough. Some skeptics and even some liberal scholars who might not be called skeptics per se will shy away from the word lying. And yet that's really what they are talking about. I've been intrigued by this. I had an online dialogue with someone named Philip Goff recently who denies the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He's not a squeamish guy, and yet he didn't like to use the word lying. But that's really what they end up talking about. For example, they'll say, well, maybe they added those things for apologetic reasons. Maybe they added to the story the idea that Jesus could eat with them for apologetic reasons. Well, that would be lying because it wouldn't have any effect for apologetic reasons if it wasn't believed, right? I mean, you're not going to convince somebody of something by adding something to a story, making it appear like it really happened, and then going, oh, ha, psych, that didn't really happen. Well, then what's the apologetic payoff at that point? Now, beyond the 12 who are named in Acts 1, we have other named people, especially women, who were not members of the 12, but who apparently testified to what their meetings with Jesus were like after his death. Mary Magdalene, for example, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, a woman known as the other Mary. Mary, by the way, was one of the most popular female names at the time. And when we read about the persecution by Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul, it mentions explicitly in Acts that he persecuted both men and women. So I believe these women were taking a risk as well. All right, the next option, were they mistaken? This is a very popular interpretation of what happened. Lots of people who shy away a bit from saying that they lied, they just sort of think of this vaguely as some kind of religious hysteria, sometimes you'll see a phrase, a mass delusion, an ecstasy, a mystical experience, and it's some kind of over interpretation that then when the disciples decided, oh, he must really be bodily risen from the dead, they were just over interpreting some kind of experience that really, if they'd been thinking rationally, was just a vision or just seemed like a vision. But the content of these claims makes it very improbable that they were mistaken. Now, this is important. To evaluate this mistaken option, we have to get into the details. If all that we say is that, well, they had some kind of experience that led them to think that Jesus was risen, even if we say it's a group experience, that doesn't really defend Jesus' bodily resurrection. This, by the way, is why you have so many sort of moderately liberal scholars. I've just been surveying some of them recently who hold to a kind of what's called an objective vision theory, which is that, Jesus died and then maybe his body disappeared from the tomb. Some think that, some think it didn't. But he was up in heaven. He wasn't then walking around here on earth. And then the disciples just had visions of him when he was exalted to heaven. Well, that might make sense if they had a very different kind of experience. Suppose, for example, that they had an experience of Jesus as sort of floating up in the near the ceiling, or they're outside and he's floating somewhere in the sky. Or let's say he looked see-through. You could put your hand right through him. And maybe he only spoke to them briefly. Maybe he just said, "Peace be to you. As my Father has sent me, I send you." Poof, he disappears. Now, if they knew that that was all they experienced, and if they knew that they had no experiences where he seemed, 3D, as it were, tangible, opaque, visible to all the group together, tangible to all the group together, etc., that would actually be evidence against a bodily resurrection. The most reasonable interpretation of those kinds of experiences would be that Jesus had been exalted to heaven, maybe some kind of a theological conclusion, but not a bodily resurrection. It's very surprising that people don't recognize. I've realized this in the last few years, that the disciples could have experiences. They could even have group experiences of seeing Jesus that would be evidence against the resurrection. Let that sink in for a minute. And remember, no skeptic is going to grant that they were rational in evaluating the evidence. So don't rely on that. You have to be prepared to argue that what they experienced or what they claimed was what would make them rational in believing that Jesus was raised. Okay, so what did they claim? Well, they said that different groups of them had long conversations with Jesus. This, by the way, is not what so-called grief hallucinations are like. Grief hallucinations, if there are such things, I have some doubts, but if there are not of groups of people together having this big long conversation with somebody where they can say, Jesus, would you please explain that prophecy again? I didn't quite follow that. And that he, explains it and opens the whole scriptures to them. They said that they met Jesus in the flesh on multiple occasions in groups. There's multiple occasions in the Gospels described as group experiences. Remember, I'm just saying this is what they claimed. Okay, I'd be begging the question if I said this is what really happened. But I'm willing to argue that this is what they claimed. Then we need to ask, what's the best explanation of those claims? They said that on different occasions, people were able to touch Jesus. And they said that Jesus invited them to touch him. They said that Jesus ate with them on more than one occasion in a group. They said that Jesus convinced a previously skeptical disciple, that is Thomas, that he was risen. Now, these different groupings and different appearance claims create variety in the evidence. This is very important. One area of my professional publication concerns varied evidence and independence, and how varied evidence is helpful. If we have varied evidence, this is known in the philosophy of science. If you want to prove a theory or have a strong argument for a theory concerning astronomy, you don't want to have all of your measurements being made just of things on Earth. You want to measure things that are relevant out in the cosmos, as it were, so that it's under different circumstances and so forth. That's a stronger body of evidence for the conclusion. Also, the people themselves would not have had all the same motives. James, the brother of Jesus, for example, was apparently widely respected in the Jewish community and wasn't previously a disciple of Jesus. Joanna's husband was a prominent man in the household of Herod Antipas. And you can imagine him saying, Joanna, are you really sure, that you saw these men in white at the tomb and so forth? I don't want you sticking out your neck if you're not sure. All right. They said that Jesus was with them on earth for about 6 weeks. And they said that when Jesus went back to heaven, after that, Jesus went back to heaven. And later experiences, for example, the experience that Paul had on the road to Damascus, are sharply distinguished from the meetings that they had with Jesus on earth. You'll notice Paul never claims, either in any of the stories in Acts or in his letters, that he had a meal with Jesus. And this, by the way, is evidence against some kind of a pathological hallucination, that they all just happen to go crazy in the same way. In that case, why would it stop? Once again, remember, I was already talking about how the robustness of these claims do not fit with what are called grief hallucinations. So don't let somebody tell you, grief hallucinations usually sort of taper off gradually after the person's been dead for a while. Well, these didn't taper off gradually. The claim was that they stopped abruptly. The claim was that they stopped because he went back to heaven. And in any event, the nature of these claims, with these claims of these groups and meals and so forth, don't fit the usual pattern of grief hallucinations. All right. Now, these just aren't the kinds of things that you could just be mistaken about. That's why it's so common for more skeptical scholars, or even sort of moderate liberal scholars, to, if I could coin a word, fuzzify the claims. Well, they had some kind of experiences, but they were trying to express the inexpressible, and so they weren't really claiming that these meals and things had really literally happened to them. Well, what if they did claim that that literally happened? What I think you find then is that you're sort of in your mind toggling back and forth. Well, yeah, you would know whether your friend was with you for 6 weeks, coming and going and having multiple meals with him and stuff. That's just not some vague claim that oh, shoot, I got it wrong. No, we really just had a vague sense of his presence. And silly me, I momentarily got confused and said that he had a meal with us. What? Okay. Um, if this is really what they experienced, it would be quite reasonable for them to think that Jesus was physically risen and that he was physically present. That's what it seemed like in great detail. Notice that in these lengthy experiences, they would have been interacting not only with Jesus, but also with each other. Hey, could you pass the fish over here and so forth? Um, handing the, the honeycomb and the fish to him. If this is just some sort of vision or holograph or something, it's going to drop on the floor. So if that's what it really seemed like to them, then it was reasonable for them to think he rose again. So very probably they were not mistaken, leaving the final option: Jesus really was risen from the dead. Well, now it can't be that simple, you'll say. No, it can't. Not quite that simple. How can you try to avoid that conclusion? How can we try to steel man our opponent's response? What would be your best bet? Well, the best bet is to hang on to that mistaken option and to do it this way. Say that the people involved did not even claim to have experienced those things. To remain skeptical, someone can try to argue that all of that detail was just added later. It was not claimed by the people who actually would have been in a position to know whether it was true or false, so that they would know they were mistaken. This is where Bart Ehrman's metaphor of the telephone game comes in. You're probably familiar with that, where Bart will say, well, you whisper a story to one person and then he whispers it to the next person and so on and so on. And then when we get to the end, the last person says it out loud and the first person says, no, nothing like what I said to begin with. All right, that it underwent a process of corruption before we ever got the stories that we have. In that case, the person can say, the disciples, if they did believe that Jesus was risen bodily, that was just because that's what they thought was going to happen, maybe because of Jesus' predictions, maybe because they couldn't handle the thought that he had been defeated by death or something. But whatever they experienced, it wasn't like that. So they were just jumping to conclusions. It's a very, very popular position of critical scholars. This is where the importance of the gospel accounts of the resurrection comes in. Are those physical things and those long conversations and all of that I've just been talking about later embellishments that weren't even claimed under those conditions of risk by people who had a way of knowing if they were true or not? Are they or aren't they? All right. Now that takes us to what we have to be prepared to do if we're going to make a cogent argument for Jesus' bodily resurrection. We need to have on hand evidence of what is believed by the majority of non-conservative scholars, rather than trying to base our whole argument only on what is granted by all scholars or virtually all scholars across the scholarly spectrum. Now, let me make something clear. I am not saying, hear me on this, I'm not saying that you have to just accept the Gospels on faith, or that you have to non-evidentially presuppose that they're reliable. I'm also not saying, well, Gospels are reliable, so you should just believe everything in them. Boom. They say Jesus rose from the dead, they're reliable, Jesus rose from the dead. It's not a simple linear induction like that. Here's what I am saying. I'm saying that we have evidence that allows us to tell what these authors were like by other clues in their documents and in the history of their interpretation. These clues dovetail with other information that we have, like information about gospel authorship, to indicate that they were in a position to know. Either they themselves were witnesses, like John, or they were able to talk with witnesses, like Luke. And their concern for truth, which we have evidence for, means that they included stories that they had checked out, they had reason to believe came from those original people, people in a position to know, rather than just embellishing them, rather than just saying, oh, well, like I want to believe that George Washington was honest, so I'm going to make up the story about how he chopped down the tree, the little cherry tree, when he was a kid, and told his father, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped it down with my little hatchet." And it isn't true, but it's a nice illustration of how honest George Washington was. That's not what these documents are like. So, what should we be prepared to defend? The gospel resurrection stories represent what the original people who were allegedly involved claimed. Acts accurately represents the surrounding cultural context, who claimed what. So that list of the 11 and then the addition of Matthias in Acts 1, and under what circumstances and what persecution they faced in those earliest days. Please notice that none of these things that I've just listed here is per se in itself a miracle. It's evidence, however, for a miracle. So how do we do that? Well, I want to give you what I'm going to call an evidence sampler. This is a sampler. I have 4 books out there with more information, but I want you to get a sense for the landscape, the sweep of the landscape. What are the Gospels? What were their authors like? And what was their relationship to truth? I believe we can argue very strongly that the Gospel authors were careful and honest, that they were knowledgeable and close to the facts, in the sense of close to the facts that I've just defined. They either were witnesses themselves or they had the opportunity to talk to people who were witnesses. Now, the Gospels present themselves as true. I think this is important. They intended to be believed in a literal historical sense. 2 of the Gospels, John 19:35 and Luke 1:1 through 4, and then the beginning of Acts as well, indicate this quite explicitly. In John 19:35, speaking of the piercing of Jesus' side, the speaker says that the one who saw this bore record and his record is true. And he's speaking of a literal proposition that Jesus' side was pierced and his legs weren't broken. Luke 1:1 through 4 says that the author has followed closely all that has happened as it was told by the eyewitnesses. He actually uses the word eyewitnesses. We also have the evidence of the earliest church fathers, people like Papias and Justin Martyr, right around that turn from the 1st to the 2nd century, that these were literally believed. Justin Martyr called them the memoirs of the apostles and their companions. So no, the audience did not think of them as being like the story of George Washington and the little cherry tree, or even being like a movie based on true events. When you watch The King's Speech, that movie, I like that movie. You don't expect it all to be literally true. You know that they're taking artistic license. But I think our evidence of their statements and the statements of those immediately after them shows that they were not taken that way. So if a gospel author embellished a story to convince people that Jesus was risen, that in itself would be a lie if he knew he was doing that. He'd be trying to get people to believe that Jesus ate fish, even though he knew that he just made it up. I'm stressing this because it often gets forgotten in the course of inaccurate talk about, ancient views of truth were different. They had a different view of truth. My book, The Mirror or the Mask, refutes that in great detail. So it's important to have evidence and to take very seriously evidence about their intention of being believed. Well, what kind of evidence do we have then that they weren't that they weren't lying. Okay, if we've demonstrated that they expected to be believed, they intended to be believed, I'm sure you're going to find skeptics who are going to say, yeah, fine, they intended to believe that, they believe they were hoaxing people. All right. Now, what we have are categories within categories and individual instances within the categories within the categories. I really want to emphasize this because it can be hard for people to get a sense of just this wealth. It's an embarrassment of riches of evidence. The first broad type of category is sometimes called external evidence. External evidence comes from outside of the canon of Scripture. All right. So this would include things like tiny details of geography. Something I want to emphasize here, people will say, oh, evidence from outside the canon of Scripture. You mean like, does, Josephus mention Jesus? Well, yes, Josephus does mention Jesus. But what's even better are these incidental details. We're not expecting, nor should we really expect, that some Roman writer who never converted at all to Christianity is going to say, there's this story that Jesus fed 5,000 people, like he's actually going to note a story that he probably doesn't even believe of something that happened in that small province there. In fact, lots of those writers didn't think much of that particular province. So what we're looking for here instead are things that are more subtle, and those are actually better evidence. So for example, John says that they went down from Cana to Capernaum. Now he just says that in passing, that he has it twice while this person was going down from Cana to Capernaum. Cana is a very obscure village. John was probably writing in Asia Minor. A lot of his audience members would never have heard of Cana, probably the majority of them. So they weren't he wasn't doing this to impress anybody. Like, ooh, cool. John just mentioned that you go down from Cana to Capernaum. How cool is that? I don't think he did it for that reason. I think he did it because he had walked from Cana to Capernaum. Cana's in the hills. Capernaum's actually a little bit below sea level. You do indeed go down. And when you're walking everywhere, you'd feel it. Small details of culture. For example, the fact that more than one person could be considered the high priest at the same time. It's interesting. I've been reading a lot of skeptical literature lately, and I can't remember. I think it was a book by the Jesus Seminar published in 1998 that I was just reading today. And they were like just giving this as an example of how the Gospels are inaccurate. Luke refers to the high priests, Caiaphas and Annas. See how silly. You could only have one high priest at a time. Well, actually, Josephus uses the phrase high priests, plural. So here we have one of these nice little incidental confirmations from Josephus of how the term was used. That a former high priest, you see at that time, the Romans could set up a high priest or depose a high priest. They treated it as a we might call political office. And so you could have still living the previous high priest. It wasn't a lifetime job because he could have been deposed by the Romans, and then the next guy who would be alive at the same time, and you could refer to both of those as the high priests at the same time. So that's actually a confirmation of their accuracy, not a disconfirmation. Or Jesus refers to the Pharisees tithing herbs like mint and cumin, and we have evidence from the Talmud that they did. Now, don't even get me started on Acts and Luke. It's just astounding. I encourage you to read the book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history by Colin Hemer. It's an amazing, amazing book. In Acts, he mentions, and that's the same author that wrote Luke, by the way. So Acts tells us something about the author of Luke as well. The location of an island called Cauda. And there was another author at the time who actually got it wrong. So this wasn't something Luke just went and looked up in some book somewhere. If he had, he would have gotten it wrong. And in fact, they didn't have the kind of reference works that we have today, or even that we've had for the last 100 years, that anybody could just go and kind of do all this research and get all this accurate knowledge and put it into a book. These were things that you would know naturally from being there. All right, now to a different category, internal evidences. I'm going to give just a few categories of these. These are not even all the categories, I want to emphasize, of either external or internal, and far from all of the individual instances within them. Internal evidences are things that come from within the canon of Scripture. But that doesn't mean we're just presupposing it. Don't let anybody make fun of you and say, this is for the Bible told me so. You know, there's a skeptical YouTuber who will do that. He'll play this little, the Bible told me so jingle, and he just doesn't get it. What we're doing is we're comparing these internal marks with what we know about truthful testimony. We know that from outside the Gospels. So I call this the texture of testimony. We're looking at them and we're saying, wow, these have the texture of testimony. So one kind that I've written about is known as undesigned coincidences, an incidental interlocking that points to truth. I'm going to give just one in the interest of time here tonight, so we have plenty of time for question and answer. Maybe I'll go back and give the Why Ask Philip one later. I'm going to give you the one about Jesus saying, I am among you as the one who serves. In Luke, it's talking about the Last Supper, and Jesus is there, and they start having a fight about who's the greatest in the kingdom, and he rebukes the disciples, and he says, who is greater, the one who serves or the one who reclines at the table? That's how you ate back then, you recline. And it's explicitly said in the passage, Jesus is reclining at the table. And he says, so you call me your teacher, and that's right, I am, but I am among you as the one who serves. But wait a minute, it just said he is reclining at the table with them. So that's a little weird. Here he is, he's saying, the one who reclines at the table is greater than the one who serves, but I'm among you as the one who serves. You know, we're so used to hearing sermons about, oh, Jesus is a servant leader, blah, 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 that it's hard to kind of get back into that first mindset during Jesus' ministry, that you don't actually see him doing a lot of servanty things. Okay, what's one of the most servanty things he does? Washing their feet on that very same night. But that isn't in Luke. That's only in John. John doesn't tell about them having a fight on that night. And John doesn't tell about Jesus saying to them, I am among you as the one who serves. But he does tell about Jesus washing their feet. Now we can understand why Jesus said what he meant by saying to them right there, right then, right that night, I am among you as the one who serves. That's an undesigned coincidence. The foot washing in the one gospel explains the saying in the other gospel. There's another category, I like this, called unexplained allusions. Have you ever listened to oral memoir, oral history? Somebody will mention something, you know, like somebody will maybe mention an acronym that you've never heard of, NSA, okay? And if you don't happen to be part of the culture, it's because it's from something that nobody's used for a couple decades. Maybe this is a veteran or something. It's like, what is that? Well, you know, it's the National Security Agency, the TSA, right? The Transportation Security Agency. And the person doesn't stop to explain it. Why? Well, because he's just got his mind on his story. He's got his mind on what it is he's remembering that happened. And if that acronym happens to come up, he's not going to pause and say, oh, that's right, you've probably never heard of that. They didn't, you know, that was before your time. Now I'm going to explain what that is. Well, that's what we find in the Gospels. That kind of unself-consciousness, that's part of the texture of testimony. The author of John mentions that the disciples of John the Baptist were having an argument about purification with somebody. And then they came to John the Baptist and started complaining that Jesus' group was baptizing a lot of people. Apparently, they were jealous on behalf of John the Baptist, their teacher. We never find out exactly what that argument was about. Maybe it was an argument with one of the followers of Jesus, but what specifically were they arguing about? The author of the fourth gospel doesn't pause to tell you. That's an unexplained allusion. That has that texture of oral memory, that he remembers what happened, and he remembers that John the Baptist said this amazing thing, I must decrease and he must increase, about Jesus putting himself below Jesus. But he doesn't bother to stop and explain what that argument was about. Another kind of internal evidence is unified personalities across stories by multiple authors. I could say so much about this. Peter, we find him being what I sometimes call lovingly argumentative. In the synoptics, we find him arguing with Jesus, no, you're not going to be crucified. And Jesus gets pretty harsh with him there, because he just can't bear the thought that Jesus will be crucified. In John's gospel, we find him saying, don't wash my feet. He's like horrified, because that was the action of a slave, because he loves Jesus. Okay, those are different stories. They're not found in all four gospels, but it's the same guy. It's the same Peter. It's the same personality, impulsive and so forth, lovingly argumentative. Jesus, I have a whole talk called Only One Jesus. And I have stuff about this in my book, The Eye of the Beholder, about the Gospel of John. How we find these tendencies of Jesus. He can be cryptic. He can be sarcastic. He loves to use object lessons. So for example, he puts a child among them in the synoptics, as when he's going to talk to them about humility. He washes their feet in John when he's going to talk to them about humility. And those stories are not found in the other one, so putting the child among them isn't found in John, and washing their feet, as we just saw, isn't found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it's the same Jesus. It's the same guy. He likes plays on words. Okay. He likes puns. He likes to kind of zing people back when they're flattering him. We find this across the Gospels. Martha, she's in Luke, she's also in John, different stories, but she's the same Martha. Okay, she's practical. Make my sister help me. And in John, Lord, let's not roll away that stone. My brother's body is going to stink by this time. Okay, that's Martha, same personality. That's part of that texture of testimony. Now you begin to understand what I mean by saying that internal evidence, it's not question begging, it's not presuppositional, but it's comparing what we know about how real life is and how real truthful testimony is. So these internal and external evidences also fit well with our external information about who the authors were from the church fathers. That could make sense that, a companion of Paul, Luke, who had a chance, especially when Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, he would have had a chance to talk to witnesses. And also that if Matthew was really a disciple of Jesus, and John was really a disciple of Jesus, and Mark was really a follower of Peter, that you would have these little marks of truth in them. All right, now to wrap up, if these authors are that committed to truth and are that knowledgeable, then they didn't make things up. They were careful what to include. They were in a position either of actually being eyewitnesses or of being very close. And it looks like they recorded what was really originally claimed by witnesses about Jesus' resurrection, because they were careful about that. Now, this view of the Gospels is a unified view. It explains the evidence much better than a disunified view where the authors are, acting like they expect to be believed. They're insisting that they're telling the truth. They're showing all these signs of truthful testimony, even saying that they care about the truth. But all of a sudden, at another time, boom, I guess I'm just going to change some fact there because that would make it a better story or whatever. That's not a unified view of the type of person that the author is. And that brings us back to the questions. Who is Jesus? What happened after he died? Did he really rise again? I'm not asking any unbeliever to accept that conclusion on blind faith. I'm asking unbelievers to accept it because that is the best explanation of all the data. Once we realize that, we can base our faith, our trust, our confidence, our personal commitment on historical fact. Now, if you want to know more, you can check out these 4 books: Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, The Mirror of the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage, and most recently, Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. You can find my author page on Lydia McGrew Author. You don't have to be my Facebook friend to follow my author page or even to follow the public content that I post on my personal page. I usually ignore friend requests, but you can message me on Facebook even if you're not my Facebook friend. You can subscribe to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. You can go to lydiamcgrew.com and find links on my website. I do, in a sense, have a podcast. It's just the audio from the YouTube channel. My friend Eric Manning ports that over. Note that there are 2 podcast links. One of them goes through November of 2024. One goes from November 2024 to the present. So if you want to come right up to date on my audio content, you'll want to look at both of those links. And you can email me, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Please be sure to introduce yourself when you write and to have a specific question in mind. Something I don't usually do is to respond when somebody just says, boom, here's this entire blog post by a skeptic, please respond to the whole blog post. That's not something I have the time or the energy to do. But you can certainly write with questions. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to take a break of maybe 3 minutes, something like that, 3 or 4 minutes. Then I'm going to come back, and I would really like us to have some time for question and answer. Here we go.
All right, sweet. The doctor is back. Just out of a show of hands, who has questions? Okay. All right, yeah. As usual, we'll keep it to 1 to 2 questions per person. Like if you have a follow-up question, then please have it ready. But yeah, we'll start off with this side of the room.
Hey, Miss McGrew, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I had a question. I really like how this argument kind of gets into textual criticism of the New Testament. I'm anticipating a response from people who would say, if we're starting to list internal evidences and external evidences, what about the supposed contradictions in the New Testament? And couldn't they, in the same way, bring those up? For example, like resurrection, like the different resurrection accounts. And I know this is not necessarily a presentation on textual criticism, but could you touch on that, like a skeptic who would bring up contradictions if we bring up those internal and external evidences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a legitimate question. William Paley, whom I'm sure Tim mentioned last week, said that the normal character of truthful witness testimony is substantial agreement with circumstantial variation. And I like that. Substantial agreement with circumstantial variation. The reason that I bring that up is because it is absolutely common for there to be at least apparent discrepancies and sometimes even real discrepancies between actual witness testimony where nobody's trying to change anything, but people are just not remembering everything absolutely clearly. What we do find with the resurrection narratives in particular, I believe that those differences are quite reasonably harmonizable. And what happens is harmonization gets put down as, oh, you're just some crazy fundamentalist. You're just doing this because you're, uh, emotionally committed to these things being the word of God. That's not true. Um, there's an example given by cold case Christianity guy, J. Warner Wallace, of a couple of witnesses talking about a robber in a store. And one of the witnesses said he ran away on foot. And another one of the witnesses said he drove away in a truck. And it turned out later that they were just looking from different angles out the window, and that one of them really did see him run away, and the truck wasn't within that person's, visual field. He ran across the parking lot, and then where the other person was standing, that person was able to see him jump into the truck and drive away. That to suggest that harmonization would not be because you're committed, somehow emotionally, that these witnesses can't be making any mistake. And so this is a big theme that I get into in my YouTube channel. My little tag for my YouTube channel is making common sense rigorous. That harmonization is actually a legitimate tool of historical investigation, where we're trying to see reasonably how these could come together. Now, that doesn't mean that I think all alleged discrepancies within the Gospels or between the Gospels can be easily or readily harmonized. I have some that I don't think can be, but you want to see that against the backdrop of the wealth of internal and external evidence, and you begin to see that what I call the reportage model actually has the weight of the evidence well behind it. And so that's, what we want to be doing is weighing up the totality of the evidence. And I think when we do that, we actually do see that this model of the Gospels is the one that comes out way ahead.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you so much.
She has it. I'll give it to Jason first. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So most scholars agree that the Gospels were written in the order of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John. In John 8:58, the Gospel that most agree to have been confirmed and written last, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was born, I am," and in doing so, takes the name of the Most High God in Exodus 3:14. Apologies, and he applies it to itself. This is the big mic drop moment of John and a pinnacle moment that shows divine claim. Skeptics will then say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would have written that Jesus has said this, but they didn't. And they claim Jesus appears more defined and claims to be more boldly equal with Yahweh as the Gospels go on. So I have two parts to this question. What is your response to the critique that Jesus gets more divine as the Gospels go on? And could the resurrection have been a byproduct of this divine telephone game?
Okay. So let me first talk about that argument that they would have written it if he had in fact said it. My husband Tim has an article on arguments from silence in history. This is just a secular published article. It's not, it's not published apropos of Christianity or the Gospels or anything. And it really turns out that in history, arguments from silence just stink. So you have the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Surely he would have mentioned Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, guess what? He doesn't. Does that mean the sources that recount the Emancipation Proclamation must be making it up because Ulysses S. Grant didn't record it? No, obviously it doesn't mean that. So we have these ideas that we can just say, well, that would have been mentioned if it were true. And I think in the case of John 8:58, the assumption is that the synoptic authors were all sitting around kind of saying to themselves, what is the single saying that Jesus said that makes the strongest, most explicit claim to divinity that we can come up with? I want to be sure to record that. Okay. And that then they would have done that. Do we know that that was their motive? No, we don't. Sitting around thinking, what is the single strongest claim that Jesus made to deity. Secondly, this whole idea of a gradual development. I have a series, I think a couple series on my YouTube channel called Gospel Development Theories Are All Bunk. And I'm very robust about this. So this will be things like you say, Jesus gets gradually more divine as the Gospels go on. Or here's one, the Gospels get gradually more anti-Semitic as they go on. Or the resurrection narratives get gradually more something or other as they go on. It's not quite clear what is supposed to get gradually more, but they're more of something as you go on. And what you find is that data is very often cherry picked. So let me give you an example. At the end of Matthew, we have Jesus saying, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. That's kind of a big deal. The name was something that Jews would sometimes use for God. Sometimes they would even use it instead to avoid being disrespectful. The name, they would just say the name. So to say that you would baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, that's Jesus kind of making a claim to deity. And Matthew's the second, he's only the second gospel according to the order you just read to me. But that's not found in Luke, right? And it's not found in John. So what you find is that you can always find these counterexamples. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't deny that some of these very, very explicit statements are found in John and not in the synoptics. But what we don't find is any gradual development like that. There's not some kind of smooth, linear, like those models of the evolution of a horse, where you have the little horse and it gets a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit, and finally you have a modern horse over here. There isn't anything like that. And it's the same way with the resurrection narratives. And I've got a whole series on this that you can look up, where I try several different definitions of the resurrection narratives being more developed somehow. Well, what if you mean a larger number of appearances? Well, here's a counter example to a gradual development of larger numbers. What if we mean more, somehow more impressive appearances and so forth? And I try to do that all the way through. And I find counter examples to all these different possible meanings for gradual development of the gospel resurrection narratives. It just doesn't fit into a pattern like that. So while I certainly agree that before Abraham was, I am is one of the most explicit claims to godhood, not only do we find some claims to divinity in the synoptics that are not found in John, but we also don't find any gradual progression of Jesus gradually becoming more and more divine. I'll just give you one more counter example to that. John's gospel is the only one in which Jesus expresses physical suffering on the cross. He says, I'm thirsty. If he's getting more and more divine as you go on, why is it that it's in John that he just expresses that very human, very believable physical suffering on the cross and not in the synoptics? And that just shows you how that you can counterexample these development theories very often.
You'll be next. Sorry, excuse me. Here you go.
Concerning contradictions in the Bible, can you hear me? Concerning contradictions in the Bible, though, couldn't a skeptic also argue that if God is truth, then basically any contradictions that appear in the Bible either have to be only what appears to be contradictory, i.e., it's not a real contradiction, or so they basically have to not be a contradiction. But if you find a contradiction in the Bible, isn't that automatically a sign that there's something amiss? So how does that work? Because I've heard that I think that a long time ago I did read the four gospels and their resurrection accounts, and there did seem to be kind of discrepancies. So the question is, how would a committed Christian explain why God would allow those contradictions, if there really are contradictions, to exist in the Bible?
Okay. So that's a really interesting question. Let me point something out here. My argument here is an argument for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. The argument I gave here tonight is not an argument per se that the Gospels are the inspired Word of God. I'm certainly not assuming that. And the conclusion I would draw wouldn't have to be that strong. Now, the conclusion I'm drawing would be compatible with that. Someone could believe what I've called the reportage model of the Gospels and also believe that they are absolutely inerrant and that they are the Word of God. But someone could believe that they are extremely highly reliable, very careful, not changing things, not making things up, etc., while also not believing that they are absolutely without error. Both positions are possible, and both are compatible with a very strong argument for the historicity of the Gospels and the historicity specifically, the topic tonight, of Jesus' bodily resurrection. So we got to keep our eyes sort of on the end point of the argument that's under view here. Now, another point that I would make here is, even if you have apparent discrepancies, even if they would be resolvable if you knew all of the information, we don't always know all the information. And that appearance of discrepancy is actually interestingly correlated with that texture of testimony. If you remember what I said a couple of minutes ago from Paley, the natural character of truthful witness testimony is substantial agreement with circumstantial variation. Now, variation doesn't have to be contradiction. Contradiction would be one type of variation. But we often find, as in the example I gave of the guy running away, an apparent, what appears to be a discrepancy in truthful witness testimony. So I would give you this thought that God could very plausibly have allowed at least apparent discrepancies in the Gospels to indicate the independence of the stories coming from, nonetheless, very highly truthful people who are in the know, and to counteract any idea that they were colluding with one another to smooth out all of those surface discrepancies. And it's going to look the same whether it's, in that case, whether it's a real discrepancy or whether it's only a surface discrepancy, and maybe if you knew a whole lot more, you would know the answer. In the case of the resurrection narratives, actually, I have a harmonization of them in my book, Testimonies to the Truth, in a chapter on what I call reconcilable variation, because it's really pretty cool to see how very reasonable, again, not I'm a committed fundamentalist Christian, but just reasonable, commonsensical imagination allows us to harmonize virtually all of those apparent discrepancies between them in a way that actually makes sense. So I don't even think that the resurrection narratives are the best examples of what I might call difficult or recalcitrant apparent discrepancies in the Gospels. But in any event, my goal is to argue that Jesus rose from the dead, and as a stage on the way to that goal, that the Gospels are really highly reliable and that their authors were not making things up. They were not being loose with the truth, which is not necessarily the same thing as arguing that they are the Word of God and they are absolutely without error.
Did you have a follow-up question? Okay, sounds good. I believe we had a question somewhere over here somewhere. Okay, yeah, sweet.
Good afternoon. So it's not really exactly related to the resurrection of Jesus, but I just had it has to do with resurrection, but not of Jesus. But it has to do with the resurrection, but not of Jesus. So in Matthew 27:52, it talks about the resurrection of like a group of people, and this is the only gospel where that's like included, and that's like a very substantial like moment, and maybe like a group of people getting resurrected, and that's the only gospel where that moment is recorded. Like my question would be, doesn't that like hinder uh the truthfulness of the gospels?
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty famous passage. Now, if you remember, I was talking a minute ago about arguments from silence in history. Um, Arguments from silence in history really stink. Remember the example I gave about the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, not mentioning the Emancipation Proclamation. Another example, Marco Polo never mentions the Great Wall of China. He visited China and brought back news about it. My husband likes to imagine somebody saying, "Think, Marco, did you see something that was, this many feet wide and this many hundreds and hundreds of miles long? Did you miss it?" Things that you would think for sure somebody would mention. And they don't. And we need to be a lot more careful about assuming that we know a goal and a motive, and we're like, somebody else, those other authors would definitely have mentioned this. I was reading a skeptic the other day who, for some weird reason, said that it was a strike against the Gospels that Joseph of Arimathea wasn't mentioned anymore after the story of Jesus' resurrection. Like, where did he expect to see him mentioned again? What he's chiefly known for is providing the tomb for Jesus. That's his importance in the life of Jesus. So, and it's a biggie for Bart Ehrman as well. And so I think here I would really just block right away that, well, if it's only in one gospel, it's automatically suspect. Bear this in mind. There is no rule of history that everything has to be recorded at least twice. I'm going to say that again. There is no rule in doing history that we have to have at least 2 recordings of any event before we have reason to believe it. That's just not a rule. It's not a thing. Okay. Now, concerning that particular incident, you'll notice that Matthew tells about it pretty briefly. So even to say, wow, it's a big moment in the Gospels, the mere fact that it's a group of people, and by the way, we don't know how many. Matthew's not specific. I think he says many, but what's many? 10 would be many. 100 would be many. 1,000 would be many. What does he mean by many? He doesn't define. But he doesn't make a big deal about it. I think the story of it is like, what, 1 verse long, 2 verses long. He doesn't go into detail. He doesn't base other arguments upon it. And so I'm not sure it's really true that Matthew even himself is making that big of a deal about it, or that the gospel authors would have been making that big of a deal about it. And this may be because some of these people were not well-known people. It says holy ones, but that doesn't have to mean, I don't know, some Old Testament prophet. After all, how would anybody know what that guy looked like? So it could be just people who were recently deceased from the, surroundings, like the region surrounding Jerusalem. I have a guess. I could be wrong about this, but I have a guess that the reason Matthew tells about that so briefly is because he didn't have more details. So this is a case where he may have talked to somebody who, claimed this, but he doesn't have a lengthy story. And I think he's not going to give us more than he has. He's not going to elaborate it. He's not going to embellish it. And so it's brief. And I think that's part of why it seems so weird. People will say, oh, such a strange passage. Yeah, you know why it's so strange? Because we'd like to know a lot more about it, because it's short. And so shortness could even indicate what I might call restraint on Matthew's part, and the disinclination to say more than what he has some kind of evidence for. So no, I don't think that's evidence against the historicity of the Gospels. And I think we just need to be willing to sort of stand up against that. And when people say, oh, this is such a big thing, surely somebody else would have mentioned it, just say, don't call me Shirley. Um, the same way with Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman will do that with John 8:58. Surely someone else would have mentioned if Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. Well, you could come back and say, surely John would have mentioned it if Jesus had said, baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, because John is clearly trying to argue that Jesus is God, but John doesn't mention that, even though he may have even had access to Matthew. So what we find is that the different authors have different things that come to their minds, different things that are of interest to them, and we don't even always know the reasons for that. I have a phrase for this. Put it in your mind: the randomness of saliency. Now, what is saliency? Well, it's something just kind of coming up in your mind. It's something seeming like, oh yeah, I want to be sure to mention that. You notice it, you think of it, you want to mention it. Saliency. The randomness of saliency means that just as in ordinary memoirs, you don't always know why somebody mentioned something. And all the more so, you often don't know why somebody else doesn't mention it. And that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Dr. McGrew, you might be more familiar with this scholar, but I believe that Mike Paulman from Faith Because of Reason actually responded to Dale Allison regarding this particular objection. He basically says that in that passage in Matthew 28, you're talking about of the wealthy, because only the wealthy could afford rock-hewn tombs. The people who died within a year, because that's how they did Jewish burial customs of the holy ones. So your like reasonable estimates could have been like maybe a dozen or so people who would have been included, like Jairus's daughter that was resurrected, or like Lazarus, or people like that. And that's why you get reports like Quadratus saying to the emperor that many of the people who Jesus raised were still in existence to this day. Are you familiar with that scholar, Dr. McGrew?
Are you talking about David Paulman?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know who David Paulman is, and he does. I don't watch long videos. I know this is terrible. Like, I want other people to watch my videos, but I don't watch other people's videos. I can take in information so much faster by reading. So I'm in general familiar with the kind of videos that David does, and I think those are really interesting points. I myself am inclined to think that it was a fairly small number. Once again, I think we have a false view. In our information age, it's very easy to be anachronistic. All right. We're live blogging things. We have news sites all over the place. So we have this notion that you had something equivalent to the Daily Jerusalem Times, Fox News, Jerusalem Daily Edition or something, where if something happened, you'd have all these accounts of it happening. And then they would come down to us, and we'd be able to go read them. So if something's found only in one source that's come down to us, this is somehow highly suspicious. That is an anachronistic assumption. Papyrus decayed if it wasn't recopied. The Gospel of Luke is about as long as a scroll anyway, so he probably didn't even have room for more stuff. He included the stuff he wanted to include, and then he was coming to the end of his scroll. Okay, so we really shouldn't import these assumptions where you're just going to find, if something's interesting, you're going to find all these reports of it out there that are still extant here more than 2,000 years later.
For sure. You didn't have a follow-up question, did you? Okay, gotcha. And then Kenan, I believe you're our last questioner.
Can you hear me well? Cool.
Feel free to speak up too. So
Yeah. Just concerning, you said something along the lines in the presentation. It wasn't directly these words, but I wrote down like minor, somewhat irrelevant details point to the idea that these accounts are true. And I think the example you mentioned was like Jesus passed around the fish, or he ate the fish, or something along those lines. I understand the point that you're making there, but do you think you could kind of like elaborate on that?
Sure. I want to separate two things. So I said two different things that maybe I think are getting combined here. So one thing I said was that the details of the resurrection narratives are important to the conclusion that he was really bodily raised. All right. So that was the thing about passing the fish, was that if he was bodily raised, you'd expect to have these kinds of, and appearing to them bodily, you'd expect to have these kinds of interactions. Okay, these multi-person interactions where they're like handing things to one another, they're handing things to him, they're seeing him from, let's say, different angles, for example. So he's 3D, he's opaque, he doesn't look like a ghost, and that kind of thing. And those details are important to the question of whether it was a bodily resurrection rather than just a spiritual vision of some kind, because it is pretty popular for scholars to say, well, they just had a vision, not a real bodily experience. And we're not going to have a good argument against that if we're too shy or too tentative, and we're like, no, I'm not going to argue that they claimed that he ate fish with them. Well, hey, there's something circular about arguing that they claimed that. All right. Now we got to explain that claim. But I think as a premise, we can defend that they claimed that. So that was the one part about the fish. Then the other thing about details as evidence of truth and the texture of testimony concerns what I called incidental details in the Gospels, which they get right. So then we can check those. Okay, so for example, that you have to go down from Cana to get to Capernaum. And then they say these in this very casual way. It's really cool. Like, so for example, if I mentioned the Shell station at the bottom of the hill, okay, and I'm telling some story, and I said, yeah, that day that I got in the accident, I had gone to the Shell station at the bottom of the hill, blah, 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 blah. And then you look into where I live and where I might go to get gas that's near my house, and there is a Shell station at the bottom of a hill. Well, that lends credibility to my story because there's this detail that's part of my story that I said in a casual way, not like I was trying to make a big deal about it, and it turns out to be true and checkable. And so that's evidence of the truthfulness of the accounts and of the texture of testimony in those incidental details that we can actually check out. So those are those two different things I was talking about.
Yeah, and this one, I appreciate the answer. And then this one's kind of a little bit off topic. And I just want to say I also appreciate like your realism approach versus kind of like just a Bible literalism, just believe what's on the paper blindly. But this one is kind of a little bit off topic from the resurrection, but somebody had asked a question earlier that kind of sparked this idea. And I just kind of wanted to get your opinion. What is your view concerning like the Bible and then the gospel specifically being like the express word of God and like everything's literal and infallible? Like what, because I know like that ruffles certain people's feathers a little bit. But obviously this is an apologetics group, so it's important to have a good grip on what scholars believe concerning that. So that's kind of my next question is like, what is your belief
my own opinion
concerning like the infallibility of the Bible, like whether or not it's the express word of God or not, the entire, like every word specifically, if that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, it's a legitimate question. And I want to say a couple things here to be very careful that I'm understood. I myself am not an inerrantist. And I think it's important for me to just be able to come right out and say, I'm not, rather than, sort of dancing around, pussyfooting around. Well, it depends on what you mean. And I'm this kind of an inerrantist, but I'm not that kind of an inerrantist. I'm not an inerrantist. But at the same time, if you are an inerrantist, here, I mean you, not you personally, but, anybody here in the audience here, or who sees this, it's going to be recorded and put out. If you are an inerrantist, you can hold the view of the Gospels that I've just been arguing for, which I've referred to as the reportage model. In fact, if you are an inerrantist, you already do hold that view. So even if you don't, name it that. So I sometimes talk about a Venn diagram. You're probably familiar with a Venn diagram. You got this football, right? And so you have this football, and we're going to label that reportage model of the Gospels, and that's what I talk about. They're always trying to get it right. They're never making stuff up, and they are highly successful. That's how I summarize it. All right. Now we got a smaller football entirely inside the bigger football. You can picture this, right? And that smaller football is labeled traditional inerrancy. Notice that traditional inerrancy is entirely within the reportage model, but there's space outside of traditional inerrancy that's still within the reportage model. So what this means is that you have what a philosopher would call one-way entailment. Traditional inerrancy entails the reportage model, but the reportage model doesn't entail traditional inerrancy. Okay, so I dislike it, and it bothers me when occasionally people who are even fellow believers who think the gospel authors did sometimes make things up, and unfortunately there are people out there. They'll say they were allowed to. They felt that was allowed, and that is their view of the Gospels, even though they're Christians. They'll say, "Well, don't listen to Lydia. She's not an inerrantist." The implication being given that if you agree with my reportage model of the Gospels, now you're not going to be an inerrantist anymore. That's not true. So you can either be an inerrantist or not be an inerrantist, and in both cases hold the view that I'm promoting. In fact, as I say, if you're a traditional inerrantist, you already do hold that view. But I would add one more thing. In terms of reliability, deliberate factual changes are a much bigger deal than accidental changes, or I won't say changes, accidental errors that result from the natural causes that affect ordinary eyewitnesses. So I'm going to close with this illustration. Suppose you're on a jury and you have someone who's testifying about a series of events connected with the crime, and under fierce cross-questioning, he is forced to admit that a given event happened on a Wednesday when he originally said it happened on a Saturday. Okay, so his original testimony was in that respect inaccurate. Now we have two different scenarios that diverge. In the first scenario, the witness says, "Oh man, you're right. Okay, it did happen on a Wednesday. I'm sorry. It's been, 3 years, and we went to that same restaurant several times that week, and I just got confused about which night it was." Very plausibly could happen. This is the plausible way that witness could make a good faith mistake while being completely honest, trying to get it right. Okay, second scenario. The witness says, "Oh yeah, you're right. I knew all along it really happened on the Wednesday. I changed it to the Saturday to make it a better story." You're on the jury. Which of these two do you now trust better going forward? Obviously, the first guy, right? Because he's at least trying to get it right. He's making mistakes of the sort that you could expect from a genuine eyewitness and an honest eyewitness, and even a highly, highly accurate eyewitness. He's just not perfect, okay? But he's a lot more trustworthy than the other guy, who, in addition to his ordinary human fallibility, is also introducing deliberate mistakes just because he thinks it makes a better story. So my kind of errancy view of the Gospels, the authors are like that first guy, and any mistakes they are making are the kinds of good faith errors that someone who is very close to the facts and who's not deliberately changing anything realistically could make. Now, that's a long answer to a short question, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. We're a little bit over time, but is there any last pieces of advice you'd have for any of us students, Dr. McGrew?
Don't be afraid to take time, absorb the case as a whole, and don't think that just because there's one objection that you don't have an answer to right in your back pocket, "Oh no, I got to lose my faith now." It doesn't work that way. Develop a tough-minded attitude, because ultimately what you have to be thinking about is, where does the weight of the evidence lie? Also, I want to make you aware, probably Tim mentioned this, of a ministry called Talk About Doubts, run by my good friend Jonathan McClatchy. This is something to point people to who are struggling with doubts and are thinking of deconverting from Christianity. It's also something to point people to who are thinking of converting or reconverting to Christianity and are seriously interested in looking into the evidence. Encourage them to get in touch with Talk About Doubts. So those would be my last words of advice.
All right, got it. Talkaboutdoubts.com. Everyone give it up for Dr. McGrew.
Thanks
so
guys.
much.
See you. Bye-bye.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell for more content. Got questions or ideas? Drop them in the comments below. Until then, next time, thanks for watching. This is Hatcher Boy Paul signing out. Peace.